Hey, my name's Tom and welcome back to Low Carbon Lifestyle. You don't have to look very far to find an article about heat pumps before it will mention insulation. It's as if they come as some kind of pair, Torval and Dean, Vic and Bob, Batman and Robin, heat pumps and insulation. And the story that we're told is that you need to insulate before a heat pump can work. But is that right? How much insulation do we need to install a heat pump? What do we need to do? How much insulation is enough to allow us to move away from a gas boiler? In this video, I'm going to try and talk through why it might be different to what you assume. In my day job, I come from an industry where consultants and engineers use the phrase fabric first to talk about decarbonising buildings. It's in almost every document about energy efficiency or so-called low and zero carbon technology. And sometimes you hear the phrase, be lean, be mean, be green. Or in other words, minimize energy use through high performance insulation, be lean. Minimize energy use through installing efficient systems so it works really well, be mean. And then finally, provide low emissions technology to meet any remaining energy demand, be green. And there is the assumption that these snappy phrases are helpful or meaningful or the right approach for decarbonising buildings. And even government funding streams like the public sector decarbonisation scheme administered by Salix ask for a whole building approach to decarbonise heating, and in doing so, ask for organisations to evidence that they've considered a fabric first approach as part of their application for funding. So, are consultants and funders right in saying that we need to focus on building fabric before decarbonising heat by installing a heat pump? And then on the other side of the coin, there's the activist community that I take lots of notice of and in many ways are inspired by. We've had campaigns to insulate Britain, which of course is the right thing to do. But maybe the correct response to the call to insulate Britain is to ask, by how much? And yeah, a really helpful question, a helpful framing set out by this essay a couple of years ago. Often when we talk about heat pumps, the conversation ends up that we need to insulate buildings so well that we don't need any heating system at all. So what's the right answer? And if the challenge is, if we understand that we need to reduce emissions as quickly as possible, what are the right steps that we need to take and in what order? Well, I think the fabric first approach is wrong if we want rapid decarbonisation at scale. And I think that be lean, be mean, be green is a lazy rhyme rather than a decarbonisation strategy. And I think that these assumptions really risk slowing down progress on reducing our emissions. And interestingly, for me anyway, recently I've started to see other people making a similar point to what I'm trying to make here. So first of all, on a work project where the consultants that I'm working on have set out in this image the approach that we may use when we're designing new buildings. Yes, to minimize energy demand through building well at that day one. We should have really efficient new buildings, but it takes a different approach for existing buildings. The consultants suggest that we should focus on decarbonising the heat source before improving systems and improving fabric. And I saw a great response on LinkedIn to the concept, to fabric first culture, by saying it should be fabric fifth. And this article that I'll link below articulates that point really very well. So let's talk through our priorities when it comes to decarbonising heat. And let's start with dispelling the myth, the big myth, that heat pumps can't work in poorly insulated homes. If a heat pump is sized correctly, if the heating pipe work and the emitters are sized correctly, a heat pump can heat any home. I mean any home, any building. Our home, which is a Victorian terrace, is heated by a 5 kilowatt heat pump, which is quite small, but it keeps us warm all year round. There are heat pumps with much bigger outputs. Our next door neighbor has a 16 kilowatt heat pump. In a commercial setting at work, you regularly see 40 plus kilowatt heat pumps. And I've even seen a 1200 kilowatt heat pump heating a leisure centre in Lancaster. So no matter what's the size of a house, there will be a heat pump or a set of heat pumps that can heat it. That's the first step. A heat pump can heat any home. So if our priority was to reduce emissions, a large heat pump working inefficiently, let's say an average efficiency or coefficient of performance of 2.5, so working at high flow temperatures with small radiators, that heat pump would be able to heat a home and would reduce emissions upon installation when we compare it to a gas boiler. How much would it reduce emissions by? Well, a gas boiler will emit around 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of heat delivered. An inefficient heat pump will emit at most 80 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of heat delivered, or 60% lower than a gas boiler. And that's a step change in emissions for those homes that could be done almost overnight. And as the electricity grid keeps on getting lower and lower emissions, the figure will keep going down. And that's a big result. So if emissions reduction is the priority, changing the heat source is a huge step forward, and we haven't even touched the fabric of the house. Next up, before we get to the fabric, we could look to improve the efficiency of a heat pump by maybe making the emitters bigger, so bigger radiators. So that would mean that we can lower the temperature the heat pump is operating at while still delivering enough heat. This may mean bigger pipes, it may mean more or bigger radiators, but it could mean that we improve the efficiency of a heat pump by at least 20%. So from a COP of 2.5 to a COP of 3. And the emissions therefore would go from 80 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour to around 67 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, or 67% lower than a gas boiler. And then finally, we've installed the heat pump, we've improved this, we've increased the size of the radiators. We could and should look at fabric so that we can reduce the heat loss completely. We could reduce the flow temperature even more of the heat pump and improve that efficiency even more. So if we start by ensuring the basics are done and done well, so double glazing, loft insulation, and if it's easy, underfloor insulation, that will help us reduce heat loss and push the heat pump efficiency that bit further. Because the house would have a lower heat loss, the heat pump could run at a lower temperature and get that little bit more efficiency out. So let's assume another 10% better, which will get us to a COP of 3.3, which would reduce emissions to 60 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, or 70% lower than a gas boiler. So you can see, and this is the key point for this video, that the majority of the emissions reduction happens with a switch to a heat pump. And then everything else is energy efficiency, which helps, which is great, but it doesn't reduce emissions substantially. So all those articles that are trying to say that we need to have loads of insulation to install heat pumps at all start to make a heat pump installation a fairly intimidating prospect, disruptive and potentially costly. You can imagine a deep retrofit having to move out of a house, redecorating, big disruption. But it's likely that your home, if it has double glazing already, if it has loft insulation, it's already ready for a heat pump. It may need some bigger or some more radiators that would help it run efficiently. It may not. And if you wanted to make significant progress on your emissions, a heat pump running at high temperatures could be installed whenever you want to. So maybe that's it. That's the response to fabric first. Yes, fabric first to an extent. Make sure the glazing and the doors are up to scratch and they fit well. Do the more DIY style insulation like rolls in your loft. But then I'd say you're probably ready to switch. And then how about insulate Britain? Yes, we need to insulate Britain. We need to make sure that we have that loft insulation and that we've carefully considered draft proofing. But don't think that you need a deep retrofit from day one. If it's a climate emergency, and if we need to reduce emissions in buildings as much and as quickly as possible, and if we have limited budget, we need to change the heat source. And then we can work to improve the building over years and years. And that's not doing everything overnight. I should finish with a couple of caveats. First of all, government grants. Currently, the boiler upgrade scheme gives a grant of £7,500 towards the cost of a heat pump installation, but only gives that if there are no recommendations left over on your energy performance certificate. If there are, then you may have to upgrade those parts of the house that are recommended to benefit from the grant. I hope, and this shouldn't be too onerous, but it could slow things down a little bit. And then second caveat is on the sizing of heat pumps. If you did install a big heat pump to reduce emissions quickly and then slowly did retrofit the house over a number of years, there's a risk that we might have oversized the heat pump and that you need less heat than it could give out. When you need less heat and it starts to struggle to turn down, that could really make things inefficient. So we should bear that in mind. And if you have a good installer that you can talk through plans with, they may be able to pick a certain heat pump or a certain size of heat pump that can work in the long term with your planned changes. So that's it. If we want to respond to climate change and reduce emissions, your heating system might just be the priority, and a heat pump would give you a step change in emissions. I've done loads of videos about our heat pump that we've been living with for 2.5 years now. If you've got any questions, then please do comment below or look at the link below for the Calendly, and you could book in a meeting with me to discuss your project a bit further.